Washoe County Library System welcomes you to our monthly series from the Historic Reno Preservation Society. Tonight's topic is Reno's Hebrew Cemeteries and Jews in Northern Nevada, presented by Sharon Honig-Bear. My name is Samantha, and I'm so happy to be here with you tonight. And now I would like to introduce Carol Coleman with the Historic Reno Preservation Society. Again, welcome and thank you.
Hello again, I'm Carol Coleman. I'm president of Historic Reno Preservation Society. We're a nonprofit whose mission is to preserve and promote historic resources in the Truckee Meadows. We fulfill that mission through education, like this program today, and advocacy. I want to thank the Washoe County Library for supporting us with this. They manage and record these sessions for posterity. I'm pleased to introduce the co-chairs of our speaker programs, Sherry Hayes-Zorn and Susan Mullen. They will tell you about the speaker and tonight's program, and they'll handle your questions after the program. Thank you. And I think I'm going to Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Mullen. Welcome everybody to Second Tuesday, Harps' Second Tuesday. Our program tonight, Sharon Honig-Bear will present Hebrew cemeteries in Northern Nevada. This presentation looks at the early days of Jewish presence in Nevada and the need to establish cemeteries for their population. The Comstock brought Jews to Nevada, engineers, storekeepers, traders, doctors, journalists, lawyers, and of course, fortune seekers. And it was a priority for early Jewish settlers to establish a cemetery. Reno's Hebrew Cemetery, was begun in 1875, and it follows Jewish customs. It is the only entirely Jewish cemetery in Nevada. Sharon is a Harps board member, tour guide. Many of you have probably taken at least one of the many walking tours that she's conducted over the years. She's a past president of Harps and is also past chairman of the City of Reno Arts and Culture Commission. Please welcome Sharon Honig-Bear.
Well, thank you for that a nice introduction. I think when we set this up some time ago, we were actually hoping we'd be meeting in person. But actually on a blustery, nasty night like now, I'm kind of glad we're all zooming in on this. So I'd like to welcome you to something that I now call Northern Nevada's Hebrew cemeteries, and abyssal, which is the word in Yiddish for a little bit about the early Jews in our region. As we said, my name is Sharon Honig-Bear. We usually spend our efforts when we're doing our tours with the history of Reno and its homes and its buildings. But today I'm going to be talking about 3 cities of the dead, a term often used for cemeteries. It's a pretty fitting term too, since cemeteries, like the communities they support, have a certain urban design. And as we tour here today, you'll find streets and a park setting and art and architecture, just like a living city. I was living in Reno for only a few months, over 30 years ago, when I first encountered the Hebrew cemetery, and I was reading something and it was mentioned. I had no idea where the cemetery was. So I called the Nevada Historical Society. And this was before we had information at our fingertips with the internet. So the go-to was you called the Historical Society. And they directed me, and I discovered a well-kept spot of green surrounded by college housing and urban bustle. It was located on the appropriately named Angel Street. It struck me immediately as a place of peace. I will talk most extensively about the Reno Cemetery, but stay tuned for some interesting tales of Virginia City and Carson City. The Hebrew Cemetery is located just west of the University of Nevada, Reno. At the time when the cemetery was constructed, it was actually 1878. This was a tranquil spot. I'm going to go back to this one. Well, I don't know. I thought I had this all together. There was no freeway below, and the location was high and above the developing city. The Hebrew Cemetery is surrounded by other noteworthy cemeteries. The Grand Army of the Republic, which you can see in the top picture, and the Knights of Pythias Cemetery, which you can see below. And Harps does offer, typically in the summer, offer a tour of all the cemeteries where you can actually walk through. The most historic of all is the Hillside Cemetery. Originally called the Reno Cemetery in 1860, Hillside Cemetery was officially established in 1875, making it Reno's oldest. It has suffered, and you can see in the bottom left picture, right picture, severe neglect, vandalism, and threats from developers for decades. But now a dedicated group of volunteers is working to return the Hillside Cemetery to its former glory. Before we talk about specifics about the cemetery, the Hebrew cemetery, I'd like to provide a little context, a little background about the Jews in the area. Jews first were drawn to Nevada from California in 1859 with the discovery of gold and silver on the Comstock. Gold and silver strikes brought a flood of immigrants from all corners of the country and in fact all over the world. Among them were Jewish engineers, storekeepers, traders, lawyers, journalists, doctors, and fortune hunters. Nevada's first directory, and I'm just showing you a page of the cover of the first directory in 1862, listed 200 Jews in Virginia City, Gold Hill, Silver City, Austin, Dayton, Eureka, and Carson City. And where was Reno on this list? Not in existence yet, because Reno was first laid out in 1868 with the coming of the railroad. So here's a view of a very primitive view of Virginia City in its early days. And on the right, you see the Levison family, who were early clothing merchants in Virginia City. Mark Levison was born in Holland. In 1849, he moved to the United States. He was naturalized in 1855. And in 1862, he moved with his family to Virginia City, where they opened a clothing store. Again, this is 4 years before Reno was even laid out. In 1871, one of the devastating fires passed through Virginia City, destroying the Levisons' home and their business, actually along with most of Virginia City at the time. This is a pattern that you're going to hear repeated as we talk about old towns here. And he kind of threw in the towel a few years later in 1875, and he moved to San Francisco, where he founded an insurance brokerage firm. I guess he learned something from the fire about the importance of insurance. So here we have a Comstock notable, Adolf Sutro. He's one of my favorite Western characters, a Prussian Jew. In 1860, Sutro left San Francisco for Virginia City. And his plan was to continue selling cigars, which was something he had been doing in San Francisco. However, he soon came up with the idea of a tunnel to drain the water from the mines to help remove the threat of flooding in the mines. The idea would become known as the Sutro Tunnel. The tunnel, unfortunately, had difficulty getting built, basically the funding, despite the support of the miners whose life would be improved by its construction. Construction finally began in 1869 and was completed in 1878, all those years. But it made Sutro the king of the Comstock because it would drain 4 million gallons of water daily. And it was rented out by the mine owners at an average of $10,000 a day. It was just that valuable to them. Sutro left Nevada a rich man, and as many of you know, he made a second mark in San Francisco. And this whole idea of making your fortune, particularly on the Comstock, and then going back to a bigger city like San Francisco was a pattern repeated. In the boom and bust of Nevada, the population shrank and Jewish communities in the mining town faded. Although they rarely numbered more than 1% of the population, Jews dominated Reno's dry good and clothing market during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I like to show this picture. You're looking south on Virginia Street, just below the railroad station. So basically commercial looking south on Virginia Street. And right at this prominent spot was Barnett's. And it was a dry goods store. And the Barnetts were instrumental in setting up a Sabbath school here. So Isaac and Thomas Barnett were early Jews, and right from the beginning of the city were involved in Jewish education. Jews were among the early purchasers of lots when the city was laid out in 1868, and Reno became the oldest permanent Jewish community. By 1900, Reno Jews numbered approximately 140 people. Many of you may never have seen this photo before. There aren't a lot of them around. For context, there are 3 current synagogues in Reno. This photo shows the 1924 building of Temple Emmanuel, which was once located downtown at 426 West Street between 4th and 5th Street. Now I believe it's a parking lot, a casino parking lot. Orthodox Rabbi Harry Opachinski was the first rabbi. The joke was that the Jews could finally stop their wandering. The building cost $35,000 to build back in 1921. It's made of baked brick, and over the entrance arch, there's a large circular window depicting the Star of David and the 10 Commandments. Sabbath school space was upstairs. Governor Boyle, Chief Justice Sanders, and other notables attended the laying of the cornerstone. It was a significant activity at that time. 200 people attended the high holiday services in 1922. So the first year that it was open for business, 200 people attended services. But by 1969, the support timbers were rotting and many congregants wanted to save the building, but the city intervened and they condemned the building, and it was formally vacated December 31st, 1970, and was demolished. Some of you may have been here when that happened. This shows the replacement building in Reno Southwest at 1031 Manzanita Lake at Lakeside Avenue. Manzanita Lane at Lakeside, that's right. It is affiliated, and the congregation, Emmanuel, is affiliated with the conservative branch of Judaism. In 1962, a handful of Jewish pioneers followed their vision of creating a religious community that would better fit Reno's progressive Western culture. 7 families, the Dickens Garrels, Garfinkels, Browns, Gumberts, Cantors, and Fieldings, established a reform congregation, and they were able to construct a building of their own in Northwest Reno on Gulling Drive. And this is how, you can see how there isn't even a parking lot out there yet, but this is how the building looked when it was first built. And there have been expansions over the years, and this is looking in from one of the courtyards. The building on the left was that original building, but there have been add-ons with a social hall and library and a number of other things over the years. Lastly, there is an Orthodox congregation, the Chabad of Northern Nevada, existing for more than 20 years at this point. And they have purchased and refitted a building, which is what I'm showing you here, at 1175 West Moana Lane. So let's get back to the cemetery. This striking image appears to be the earliest photo of the cemetery, the Reno Hebrew Cemetery, and it's dated to 1901. Note how very little there is in the surrounding area. So let's talk about the Hebrew Cemetery itself and introduce you to what makes this place unique, why it's important to the Jewish community, and some of the notables who are interred here. And I want to point out that this is still an active cemetery, which really, I think, contributes to why it looks so good. The cemetery is often known as the House of Eternity, and its land has physical boundaries and is considered holy. A special consecration ceremony takes place at its inauguration. A consecrated Jewish cemetery means that customs, such as no burial on the Sabbath and rapid burial of the deceased, that those customs will be followed. Only Jewish symbols are permitted in a Jewish cemetery. Only Jewish clergy or lay people may officiate at a burial service. The cemetery is closed on the Sabbath and all Jewish holidays. Just as synagogues preserve Jewish continuity in life, so do Jewish cemeteries preserve Jewish continuity in the afterlife. There is also the tradition of establishing a Chavurah Kadisha, or a sacred society, which is responsible for the care of the deceased, including washing the body in a traditional manner. They also care for the bereaved family. And yes, Reno has a group that is still following this ritual. This marker represents one tradition common in Jewish life cycles. Here, the grave is marked, but there is no stone. After about a year after the burial, mourners gather at the gravesite for a ceremony called the Unveiling. And this involves the placing, finally, of a headstone or tombstone. The Reno Hebrew Cemetery is the only entirely Jewish cemetery in northern Nevada, but there are remnants of ones in Virginia City and Carson City, and I'll talk about those in a moment. Establishing a cemetery is one of the priorities of a new Jewish community. So only 10 years after Reno was founded in 1868, this cemetery was established. Reno's Hebrew Cemetery is used by both synagogues that I mentioned, Emmanuel and Temple Sinai, with oversight by their own nonprofit, the Hebrew Cemetery Incorporated. And each congregation pays dues for the cemetery's upkeep. It's time to point out, and you can see it clearly in this photo, that this park-like setting is enhanced by thick green grass and shady trees. And when I was there a few weeks ago taking some photos, the groundskeeper was mowing the lawn, and oddly, the cemetery seemed very alive on that day, with the smell of the green, freshly mown grass. This is the groundskeeper's dog, and he was quite friendly, and you could tell how comfortable and familiar he was walking around the cemetery. The site has 300 graves with about 12 remaining spots. Unlike many cemeteries, individuals do not actually own their own plot. The Cemetery Association retains ownership, and people have what is called an easement of use for their plot as needed. And this contributes to the beauty and the upkeep of the common property. In other words, because the association owns it, they take care of all of that, that development and care of the property. The job of establishing the Hebrew Cemetery fell primarily to David Lockman, a local merchant who purchased original lots in Reno in 1868. He was right there. Mr. Lockman, who was buried in the cemetery along with his wife, Harriet, co-founded the Reno Hebrew Benevolence Society in 1879 to assist newcomers. And in the absence of a rabbi, he was often called upon to lead high holiday services. Lockman knew Jacob Davis, a Jewish merchant he met in Virginia City in 1861. In case the name isn't familiar, Davis was the originator of riveted pants, and he was joined by his supplier, Levi Strauss, in San Francisco to patent what we now know of as blue jeans. Mr. Davis's shop in Reno was on North Virginia Street, just north of 2nd Street. And this early photo shows the vicinity of his shop on the left. And now, where after much research, they estimate that the actual shop would have been, this was all wooden sidewalks and wooden buildings. There is now this wonderful plaque, and if you've never actually walked that block, I encourage you to do that on a nice day. It is interesting that I did a fairly extensive search looking for a photo of Mr. Lockman, and I turned up nothing. But when he died on November 3rd, 1901, as seen here in this obituary, the Reno Evening Gazette headlined it, "Death of an Old Resident." And this is hard for you to read, so I'll just read a section of it. He came to Reno and located when the town consisted of but 1 or 2 houses. In fact, he was among the earliest buying property from the railroad company that is today one of the best pieces of property in the city. In the cemetery, these are the entry steps and the monument to David and his wife, Harriet. Excuse me. The newspaper said that he was laid to rest at 3 o'clock, and a large number of his friends of the Pioneer followed the remains to this exact spot. And by the way, David's brother Benjamin has an equally impressive gravesite. Sadly, David's wife, Dora, died young, but she was most notable as the first person to be brought for burial in a motorized hearse. So here you go, you have an established cemetery. So let's look at some of the features that we find as we walk through the site. You might notice that the cemetery contains headstones, flat gravestones, and some elaborate statuary. There are even some old wooden markers, and Barney Frank might be the most notable among them. He was a gambler, and he was found dead on Virginia Street. Not much else is known about him. The wooden markers are about 100 years old, and you can see they're slowly fading into the elements. There are even 13 unknown graves. There are no records on these, but they found remains when new graves were being dug. Let's take a look at some of the key features typical of any cemetery this old. You will see many infant and children's graves. And I did a little research on this. I found it interesting that during this period, infant and neonatal mortality was high. About 150 out of every 1,000 children under 1 year died about 100 years ago. And they often think that figure would be underrepresented because often still life births were not even considered among that mortality, and there were many stillborn. So compare 150 out of 1,000 100 years ago to about 5 in 1,000 today. Here you see the white marble headstone for Newton Abrams, and it's topped by a gentle lamb. The lamb motif also graces the graves of Jerome and Ronald Simpson. Jerome was 9 years old, and Ronald was 7 years old when they died. Research showed that Jerome played a second grade farmer at the Southside School's flower show parade in 1925, but only 4 years later, he was dead, and I could not find any more information about him. So there are some stories, and anybody who does any historical research will know there are many stories, no matter how deep you dig, you may never uncover the full story. Especially on the older monuments, we see a great deal of artwork. There is an entire language associated with images on tombs, similar to that whole period, Victorian period, when there was an antique symbolism associated with flowers and gemstone and other Victorian objects. As we saw a moment ago, we saw sleeping lambs indicating the innocence for children. The lamb was really only found, if you're looking at Jewish symbolism, the lamb is really only found on the older Victorian era graves. I want to go back there for a minute. The symbolism of a draped urn, which you see here, typically denotes mourning, and it signifies dignity. A veil, the drape is a veil cutting the person off from their earthly world. You'll also see, as you can see here, flanking either side of the Abrams headstone, undraped urns. And in this case, the urns usually denote the soul themselves. I like to point this out. At the very top of this headstone for Morris Nathan, who died in 1909, you'll see two Hebrew letters, and that's where the arrow is directing your attention. And those are the Hebrew letters for Pei and Nun. And they stand for the word Po Nikbar, meaning here lies. Very common in graves, regardless of religion, here lies. But on Hebrew graves or in Jewish graves, you'll often see those two letters, the Pei and the Nun. And you'll find it throughout. The Star of David is probably the most recognized Jewish symbol, appearing on the Israeli flag. The meaning behind the Star of David comes from King David's shield. You will also notice on this particular headstone that both the English and Hebrew name of Miss Silverman is carved. So Rebecca is Rivka in Hebrew, and the Bas means daughter of Abraham, daughter of Avraham. So you will sometimes see that. In this case, it's transliterated, so those of us who cannot read Hebrew can still read that in English. Rachel Friedlander's monument uses the Star of David in the center there, but it also is surrounded by carved laurels. And the laurels represent that the person will remain ever green, ever fresh in people's memory. And again, you see the two words there, here lies. Recently, when I was walking there, I went all the way to the back. You can even see the back fence there of the cemetery. And I had never noticed this headstone before, but I thought this was a very beautiful representation of the Star of David. It's three-dimensional, carved out of the stone itself. Another common and recognizable Jewish symbol is the hand spread out in priestly blessing. It indicates that the interred is a descendant of Aaron, the prophet, high priest, and the elder brother of Moses. And also Star Trek people might recognize it too. The menorah or candelabra is also a common Jewish symbol representing universal enlightenment and bringing light to oppose the dark. It's generally used on the graves of women as a symbol of their bringing light to others. This lovely stone incorporates two lions, According to Jewish tradition, Jacob, who is also known by his name of Israel, was the father of 12 sons. Each son represents one of the tribes of Israel. Judah was the fourth son of Jacob, and his tribe is represented by a lion. Jewish people are said to have come from the tribe of Judah, so any lion symbolism reflects that story. There are some unique headstones too, mostly reflecting modern thoughts on life and death. Symbols can be included for things that mattered in life. As you might notice here they included a golf bag. Or in this case, there's a Masonic symbol, and it also represents Mr. Miller's connection to the military, his military service. I was surprised to find this stone recently. It's the first that I noticed with a photo image. I was intrigued, but a modest internet newspaper search didn't turn up any history on the champ. And I had to include this funny headstone. Here comes Sam, there goes Sam. Gives me a laugh every time I see it, but it's too bad that Sam's name was never included, so I couldn't find any more information about him. One last thing before we move on. You will probably notice a common custom to leave a stone at the grave of a loved one. It's rooted in ancient times, and throughout the centuries, the tradition has become part of the act of remembrance. Sandra Medvin's grave had a whole lineup of rocks, including some that were vividly painted. And at the time I was there was even one that said, "I miss you," along with ones that had hearts and kisses painted on. And here, this flat stone not only had a collection of remembrance rocks, but if you look at the lower left-hand corner, here's another indication of something that they loved to do in life. Obviously, Leon and Jenny liked ballroom dance. And Randy Wallace's grave has a monumental stone on it. Many early gravestones proudly announced the country of origin for the interred. In this cemetery, the immigrants came mostly from Eastern Europe. It's difficult for me to read the German on this stone, but it is also interesting that there is an angel. As I said, this is not a common symbol on Jewish graves. I've already shown you Rachel Friedlander's headstone when I was showing you the laurel, but I'm repeating it here because this was interesting to me that she hailed from Saverne, Alsace. It was interesting that there are 5 graves indicating a connection to Alsace-Lorraine. My colleague, Steve Matlis, explained that the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 had its effect. In 1871, the region was transferred from French jurisdiction, where Jews lived comfortably, to German rule. And as a result, there was an exodus from the region, and Reno and other refuge cities were the beneficiaries. So they just left what was now a German area or managed to come to the United States. Here is the grave of Nathan First, a native of Germany. So what I'm going through here is indicating where people really came from. Most of the immigrants came from Eastern Europe, but and so I just want to show you some examples. So Nathan First came as a native of Germany. Many others hailed from Russia, Hungary, Warsaw, Poland. Here it says Mr. Abrams was born in Poland. And actually, I found that interesting. He was born at Poland. This, hold on. This was preparing for this presentation. I started to dig a bit deeper into the history of some of the early folks interred here, and I did not know much story about Jacob Cohn. His obituary called him, quote, an old merchant of Comstock days. And in the 1860s, he had the White House clothing store. This was up in Virginia City. It went on to say the news of his death was received sadly by his old friends, where he had a large acquaintance, especially among the Jewish residents. He amassed a fortune, but was ruined by the big fire of 1877, which destroyed a large portion of the city, again, Virginia City, and ruined thousands. The firm reopened its business, but after a few years, Mr. Cohn moved to San Francisco, where he lived in retirement. He was survived by 6 children, and 2 of the sons, Louis and Henry, lived in Reno. So I think, I don't have that confirmed, but it seems to me that's why, even though he had been living in San Francisco, he still had family living here. And that must be the reason why he ended up being buried here in Reno. Beyond their pride in their nationality, another source of pride for many Jews for over 100 years has been their military service. The oldest marker is for the Spanish-American War veteran, Corporal Mark Robinson, who served in 1898 in the 1st Nevada Infantry Company A, which was a volunteer battalion within the continental US. He did not go overseas. His dates are not on the headstone, but some research found that he was born in 1860 and died in 1827. I also found out that his nickname was Moxie. He lived at 308 State Street, and he was a resident of Reno for more than 30 years. Apparently, he worked at the Spark Shop for the Southern Pacific Railroad. Many other graves of veterans are marked with their military service. Samuel Blatt was a captain in the Medical Corps. Dr. Blatt was a member of Temple Emmanuel and a physician for many years at the Veterans Hospital. A native of New York, he had resided in Reno for 28 years, and he lived at 2490 West Moana Lane. I just like to put in where they lived because it gives you a sense of how the city changed. Private Robert Schinkowski served in the Signal Service during World War II. He resided at 1110 Plymouth Street, and he died at home. He was a native of Oakland, California, and he had been employed as a clothing salesman. He was buried with full military honors. And even though he was not I'm talking now about military markers, I'm just going to sneak in Robert's father here, Ira Schinkowski, because many people didn't know him. Ira began Shim's Army surplus on Sierra Street in 1945, and due to a flood, the store relocated to 125 West 3rd Street, where it continued to service the people of Reno, and is now reborn as a speakeasy influenced bar called Shim's in their honor. Others serving during World War II included Arthur Gould and Sergeant Emmanuel Ash, George Madison and Sergeant Irving Margolis. Reuben Chladni served in the Navy. Corporal Lee Saman served in Korea. I think you get the idea of how important military service to our country was. But I noticed one new thing which I wanted to show you. The grave of William Lebovic. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It has a medallion that I had never seen before. Holocaust survivor. Mr. Levithick was born in Hungary. The story is too long to detail here, but he faced discrimination in the Hungarian army. And in 1941, he was rounded up with 250 others into cattle cars for 36 hours. And they found themselves at the border between Russia and Poland. And they were as slave labor. Willie, as he was known, and some others escaped to the Slovakian border. Most of the people were shot, but he escaped with 3 others, and he endured work with the Russian partisans until the end of the war, passing as a Christian. He and his wife finally got visas and lived for 17 years in Santiago, Chile, and he emigrated to the US in 1963. Let's move on past military service. If you take a wide view of the surroundings, your eye naturally is attracted to what I call the three tall markers of the pioneering families. I'll spend a moment talking about them. The Shire, Levy, and Jacobs families were early Northern Nevada pioneering families, and each monument is topped, as I mentioned before, with a carved, draped urn. Jacob Shire was born in Warsaw, where he became a rabbi, married Amelia, had 3 daughters. They moved to Carson City in 1863. He brought much needed religious practices with him, and the Daily State Register newspaper conferred the title Rabbi for the state of Nevada on him in 1872. In this close-up, you'll notice that his monument says Warsaw, Russia, not Poland, because that's where the country lines were at that particular time. It's also curious that the rabbi died before the cemetery was established. Was he reinterred here later? Don't know. During his life, he owned a woman's clothing store, which is located where the Capitol is now. After his death, Amalia operated the store and raised her 3 daughters, and both of them are buried here in the Reno Hebrew Cemetery. The family dynasty carried on when one of the Shire daughters married Saul Levy, who erected a pillar for our brother Fred Levy. Saul joined his brother Fred and in Reno, and they had a store 1881. And I want to point out, because this came up a few years ago, Saul Levy and his brother Fred Levy are not related to William Levy, who lived in what is now the Sundance Books, the Levy Mansion. Interestingly, though, they were all, they were all in the dry goods clothing businesses. The last pillar marks the Jacobs family plot. Father Solomon was an early Reno merchant and civic leader. He was called a Reno pioneer, and he was given the honor of shoveling the first spade of dirt during the groundbreaking for the Temple Emmanuel that I showed you before, that was constructed in 1921 and has since been demolished. His wife, Hannah, and other family members are also buried here. Just an interesting footnote. It was pointed out to me that stone carvers were in short supply in the early days of Reno, and some headstones, and particularly the more elaborate art, could be ordered from catalogs, and some might even be expensively transported from Europe. The final carving then of names and dates and any other information could easily be accomplished with local workmen. I'm unclear whether or not that was the case with these, but I did find that interesting and something that might be worth pursuing about early stone cutters in Reno. There are other families to talk about. I like to take a walk among the notables, some names that might sound familiar to us in our lifetimes. Harry Parker was co-owner of Parker's Western Wear, a Reno tradition since 1919. It catered to locals and famous customers like Walter Matthau, Jerry Lewis, Bill Cosby, and Cary Grant. Harry received the Raymond I. Smith Civic Leader of the Year Award by the Reno Sparks Chamber of Commerce. Harry came to work for his brother in 1945 after fighting in World War II, and he bought the business in 1966. His gravestone says, "Beloved husband, father, and grandfather, he loved life, family, people, and his city of Reno." Some other notables. Abraham Zatuni put Reno on the map when he built the Art Deco-styled Hotel El Cortez in 1931. Born in Damascus, Syria, Abe first came to Reno in 1920, and he opened the silk and linen shop and then the Vogue shop. And these were very high-end women's clothing shops. When he opened the El Cortez, it was the tallest building in Reno, and it too served wealthy clientele. This is the grave, the headstone of Joseph Zatuni, who was Abe's nephew. He served for 25 months overseas in World War II, earning a variety of medals and ribbons. He returned in 1945. I found this interesting. He returned on the Queen Mary as one of 5 Nevada soldiers coming back from service in the European theater. He was employed as a clerk at the Vogue shop, which I just mentioned, owned by his uncle. And after Abe sold the Vogue shop, Joseph bought the liquor store next door. Here's the grave of Nathan Blackwelloski, who came to Reno from Russia in 1914. In a common path for Jews, he started as a junk peddler and with prosperity opened a scrap metal yard, eventually investing in real estate. 3 of his sons, the Blackwelloski brothers, leased the El Cortez property from Abe Zatuni, adding the legendary Trocadero showroom that featured Chico Marx, Victor Borge, and others. One of the joys of doing research is discovering a story that you never heard before. This is the case with Martin Kronberg. He moved to Nevada in 1941 and was a pilot for 56 years. But what really caught my eye, because this is just really off the wall, was that he was the first licensed crop duster in Nevada. Didn't even know anything about that. During World War II, he was a flight instructor at Yelland Airport in Ely, then manager of the Sparks Airport. Kronberg had been the manager of the Carson City Airport since 1973. Other merchants whose names may sound familiar, depending on how long you've lived here, are Teddy Bear Havas from Havas Motors, Simeon Edward Edises from Edises Jewelers. The cemetery is well kept, as I mentioned, and that has kept vandalism to a minimum. I was surprised when I came across this photo from 1985 showing the Levy Monument toppled. At a different time, I found an article from 1962 saying that two youth toppled the monument on New Year's Eve, but they were obviously put back together. A special community memorial service takes place each fall on the Sunday between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rabbis gather, the public is invited, and the rabbis provide prayers. As I mentioned earlier, this is still an active cemetery, and in fact, the Cemetery Association realized some time ago that it was running out of room. It prompted the purchase of a decommissioned street to the south of the current facility. The very long and narrow property is to be entered via landscape courtyards from both ends, which will create a transition space. 2 landscaped oases will produce a sense of enclosure to the cemetery. Fundraising for this phase is currently underway, and it's estimated, since the cemetery has already lasted over 100 years, that this expansion will serve the community for at least another 100 years, keeping up that long-standing tradition. Not all Hebrew cemeteries have fared as well as the one in Reno. I will briefly mention the fate of the ones in Carson City and Virginia City. And I just like to say I owe a debt of gratitude to a researcher named Sue Silver, bringing to light the Hebrew cemetery in Carson City. The present Lone Mountain Cemetery map doesn't even mention the Hebrew grounds at all, nor is it marked as such. The Lone Mountain Cemetery is administered and supervised by the Carson City Department of Parks and Recreation. Do really find that kind of odd, but according to available records, there were originally 7 separate cemeteries which were formed into one cemetery known as Lone Mountain in 1971. There are sections for Masons, Oddfellows, Catholics, 2 Babyland areas, the Hebrew Cemetery that I'm talking about, Grand Army of the Republic, Veterans, and a city cemetery section which dates back to territorial days. The 40-acre site represents a unique cross-section of early day Nevada. On a recent visit, I tried to envision the map as I headed out to the northwest corner, and I found this 10 Commandments monument from 1974, which was constructed by the Fraternal Order of Eagles. So when I saw this, I kind of figured I was on the right track and that this must be the right section of the Hebrew cemetery. And I continued to walk, as you can see, through the dust and the dirt. Some of the oldest stones in the Lone Mountain Cemetery are made of sandstone from Abe Curry's quarries, which are located on the site, what's now the Nevada State Prison on 5th Street in Carson City. The Jewish residents of Carson City, many of whom were early settlers in the town at the time of the gold and silver discoveries on the Comstock, acquired land for a cemetery, just as they did in Reno, needing to address the needs of their community. By March 24th, 1862, for $150, the Carson Hebrew Benevolent Society, who was represented by Samuel Price, purchased 2 acres of land that was described as being situate in Park Place, Carson City, Nevada. And this image shows you an overview of this section of the cemetery. This much more recent map indicates in yellow the area that has been historically the Hebrew cemetery. There are 19 marked graves related to the historic years of the settlement of the Carson Valley. The earliest marked burial in the Hebrew cemetery dates to February 1873. The history of Carson City, however, suggests that there should have been some earlier graves. So there might have been burials up in either Virginia City or Reno. Even though those were far away, given the times, there just wasn't a place right in Carson City to inter the bodies. There are still burials taking place in this cemetery, just like the Hebrew cemetery in Reno. And note, unlike the Hebrew cemetery in Reno, which has grass between the plots, here again, you just have dirt and rock linking the different grave sites. The next slides provide a close-up of several of the graves. As in Reno, the older markers are often more elaborate, and you'll notice Hebrew along with the English. I noticed something new to me when I was walking around the historic grave sites, the use of the letters FLT and this interlocking chain effect. You may know it, it was new to me. A little research led me to the fraternal group, the Independent Order of Oddfellows. The letters stand for friendship, love, and truth, and the chain links represent those beliefs. This lovely monument kept stonemasons busy. It shows Mr. Harris was not only an odd fellow, because you can see the links there, but he was a Jew with the Star of David, and he was a Mason as well. There are many smaller stones like the one on the right. I found quite a few stones broken or laying flat away from their mountings. I enjoyed exploring the stories of some of the interred, and I will give you a sense of some of the notables buried in this cemetery. And I was surprised how many unique stories there were there. Probably the most notable grave is for Abe Comb. He's best known for identifying Datso Lali and her stunning baskets. Cohn was a well-known resident and merchant of the capital city for more than 50 years. I did find it interesting that his wife's grave is much more elaborate than Abe's. All he has is that small stone there. He was born in California in 1859. He spent his boyhood in Bodie, California. In 1882, he moved to Carson, where he opened a mercantile and clothing store. He began collecting the basket works of the Washoe Indians, and soon his hobby overshadowed the rest of his business. And soon he moved much more into the native artifacts, and he called his store the Kit Carson Curio Store, and he actually built up a very large trade. Abe discovered, and I'm saying that that's repeating what the headline on his obituary said, Datso Lali's talents while she was working for his family as supposedly as a housemaid. He encouraged her to keep alive the dying art of basket weaving. And this is, as I said, a copy of his obituary. I love this story. Another resident with an interesting story is Morris, also known as Mendel Aschheim, a pioneer barber. Well, I don't think he would be terribly notable, except that Dan DeQuille wrote about him in the Virginia Enterprise. And I'm going to read you now a passage that made him famous. Aschheim was one of those who rushed to Meadow Lake at the time of the mining excitement at that place. So here's a barber, right? He opened a shop under a tree, digging holes in the ground with a pick in order to make his chair stand level. He had the first shave in the new shop, and once or twice during the operation, Morris threw down his razor, took up his pick in order to regulate a leg or two of the chair. Understand, he's out doing this outside in nature. So he had his combs, brushes, and other tools stuck up against the trunk of the tree. And he was loud in his boast of having the biggest and best lighted barber shop in the world. While we were being polished off, about a dozen other customers who had not seen a razor in more than 6 weeks dropped in from the hills and seated themselves in line upon a pine log to await their turns. The shop was a success right from the start. So Western ingenuity, there's Mendel Aschheim, and this is his somewhat broken grave. Sometimes when I do research, I come across stories that I had no idea existed, and that's the case with Hirsch Harris. He was a well-known figure in political life at the Capitol. He had a career both as a state senator and member of the assembly representing Douglas County. But this is where the story gets crazy interesting. I probably wouldn't mention it if he were just another politician. Harris was also known for his distinguished career as a melter and a refiner at the Carson City Mint. Jobs that I never even knew there were such jobs as a refiner and a melter, but that's what he did. So he's on the job for a short time, and he noticed that a lot of gold bullion was missing in 1895 to 96. And he figured out it was about $77,000 of gold bullion, which was a great deal of value over a century ago. So, he started to investigate, and eventually he was lauded for his honesty, and he became a witness for the prosecution. The federal government stepped in, yielding, as of the fallout of all of this, it yielded the death of one man, 2 men went to jail, and another one paid a fine. but nobody ever really found out what became of the largest part of the loop. This is a whole story in itself, but one that I would not have found out if I was not tracking down Hirsch Harris's burial spot. I could go on with other stories, but I will end with Carson City Cemetery with Joseph Platt. This is his grave. His obituary from the Daily Appeal, April 17, 1907, called him, quote, a pioneer merchant of Carson closes his long account with life. I love the poetry, the much more poetic language that they used to use in the newspaper. And this is again, continuing the quote. It is said that he passed away peacefully with a smile upon his face, as a man of his good and peaceful life might well afford to die. The obituary says he was born in Germany, and at 16, he made the trip to California via the Isthmus of Panama. And he came to this city, meaning Carson City, in 1862, established a clothing business, another dry goods business, and from that time until a few weeks ago, conducted his business. I'm still quoting here. He was recognized as one of the leading and highly successful merchants of the state, and his acquaintance reached every portion of Nevada. And I love this old photo with him on the right standing outside of his store, Joseph Platt's store. Reading on in the obituary, the deceased was one of the oldest and best informed members of the local order of Masons. His life in Carson City was an unblemished record of his integrity in all his dealings. And if he ever had an enemy in Nevada, the Appeal never heard of it. And this photo shows him in his later years in his yard, in his home at 402 North Curry Street. Joseph's more notable brother, Samuel Platt, is actually buried in the Masonic Cemetery in Reno. Samuel was a distinguished lawyer, politician, and public servant in early 20th century Nevada. Now we'll just briefly move on to Virginia City for a quick visit to its cemetery, which is located more than a half-mile north of the main cemeteries, the Protestant and Catholic cemeteries. It's difficult to find, and the site is not connected with the large cemetery, the rest of the large conglomerate of cemeteries. So I have a personal funny story on this. Many of you know tour leader and writer Debbie Hinman. She's always game for a history adventure, and a few years ago, we headed to Virginia City in search of this cemetery. What we hadn't factored in is that it was winter, and a particularly snowy one at that. We headed down the unpaved steep road to the Hebrew Cemetery. So far, so good. And then we stopped, stuck, and no amount of rocking or reverse or even curses moved us forward. Thank goodness for cell phones, and the sheriff was with us surprisingly soon. It must have been a quiet weekday in Virginia City, and he hitched us up and got us out. We decided to abort our mission on that particular day. And this is a really a good view. You can see just how isolated the Hebrew Cemetery is in the hills there. During the height of the Comstock, this cemetery, known as the Jewish Cemetery, served the burial needs for Virginia City's thriving Jewish community. The cemetery was established in 1863 and was described as, quote, a very handsome plot of ground. And you are looking at it. This marker identified 23 burials. The oldest seemed to be from 1863, the year the cemetery was established. It wasn't easy to find much about many of these early Virginia City residents. Jules Hamburger was born in 1812 and died in 1867. He was an assayer, which was obviously an important profession at that time. Aaron Cohn was only 10 months old when he died. And he was one of the first buried in this cemetery. Most of the women just were cold trails. I did find out a bit about Louis Reeb, R-E-E-B, who died in 1874 at 59 years. He was a native of Silesia, Germany. And again, I found interesting, his name was Louis Rebetsky. And like many immigrants, he shortened his name upon arrival in the new land. So he went from Rebetsky to Reeb. And his brother Mark is also buried here. The last one in 1897, the last one that we have a marked date burial for is Isaac Cohn. And all I could find out about him was that at his death, the court appointed an administrator for his estate, which means there probably were no survivors. And you can see again his damaged gravestone in this photo. As the Comstock mining activity ebbed in the late 1880s and the early 1890s, Virginia City's population shrank. As a result, the cemeteries, including the Hebrew cemeteries, fell into disrepair, and over the next 100 years, desert vegetation reclaimed the landscape, and periodically congregations and service clubs have come to clean up the site. Unfortunately, the cemetery has been the subject of anti-Semitic and other vandalism on several occasions during the past 100 years. Headstones have been destroyed or defaced, and the cemetery generally desecrated. Fortunately, there have been efforts to recognize the cemetery and identify some of the deceased. A significant marker set in stone was erected in 2005. Although it's located actually near the major cemetery complex, not at the actual site a half a mile away of the Jewish cemetery. At the actual site is the marker that I showed the close-up before, and it does have the names of the interred. A fence has been erected around the perimeter, and periodically cleanup crews from area synagogues and local historic groups still come by. And this was a group a number of years ago from Temple Sinai in Reno, and the star is no longer there, I noticed. A more recent cleanup effort, I believe this was a group from the Reno Chabad. As I've indicated, I am not an expert in this topic, but I am grateful to the massive amounts of information that can be gleaned from the internet, from Find a Grave, from newspapers.com, to name a few. In fact, I wouldn't even know about that cemetery in Carson City if it were not for the internet. But if you are interested in knowing more, I show you a picture there, and here's a copy of my own copy of The Jews in Nevada. There's no better source than John Marshall's book to learn more about the Jews and the Jewish history of the state. This well-researched book came out in 2011, and you can still purchase it. While the focus of this presentation has been Jewish cemeteries in northern Nevada, the story of the story of Jews in Nevada goes on. As of 2017, Nevada's Jewish population was approximately 76,300. Jews have always been one of Nevada's most active and influential ethnic minorities. They were among the state's earliest Euro-American settlers, and from the beginning, they have been involved in every area of the state as businessmen, agrarians, scholars, educators, artists, politicians, and civic professional and religious leaders. Excuse me. I'd like to thank you for taking this virtual journey with me and with Historic Reno Preservation Society. This is how you can reach me, but you can also check out historicreno.org to link to many other enlightening stories about our area and our unique history. And I hope to see you next time. So thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. It was wonderful. It was a really great program, and I appreciate you really working to make it a real great program for our event tonight. So there are a couple questions, and you've kind of answered a few of them as well during your presentation. I guess the first one I would ask, you mentioned the cemetery here in Reno. Then there's three different groups associated with the Jewish community, but you only mentioned two, I thought, are using that cemetery. Do you know a little bit more information? Maybe you can share.
Well, yeah, I mean, whoever did that question, good listening, because I kind of had to check that out myself. As I said, there is an association that oversees the cemetery here. And I went again to my colleague, Steve Matlis, because he is on the cemetery board and this association board. And I said, do all three congregations actually pay their dues? Because that's really what you're talking about, is contributing money for the upkeep of the cemeteries. And he told me that just Sinai and Emmanuel are contributing, so that's why I made that distinction. And quite honestly, I may be speaking a little out of turn here, but really Orthodox people may not consider that cemetery kosher enough to use that word. In other words, there are even more restrictions on an Orthodox cemetery. If someone has a tattoo, they can't be buried there. If someone has committed suicide, they can't be buried. I mean, there are, whenever you get deep into in the weeds in any religion, you'll find all kinds of other regulations and things like that. So that may be the reason that the Chabad people don't generally contribute, which isn't to say that there are not Orthodox people buried there. I don't know that. But Steve did affirm for me that the financial contributions come from the Reform and the conservative congregations.
As you were going through, exploring Carson City and then Virginia City, is there a reason why? I was curious about the parks when you're mentioning they kind of oversaw the Carson City cemetery. And so is it Lone Mountain, the whole all of the, of the 7 little cemeteries in Carson City that are overseen by that?
Right. They apparently oversee the entire Lone Mountain. Anything that now qualifies, if you will, as being part of the Lone Mountain Cemetery is over the jurisdiction. This is, again, not by a private association, nonprofit or anything, but it is, I thought that was very strange, especially you have to walk through that cemetery to see how little park-like setting it is. And that's part of why I like to distinguish in the Hebrew cemetery in Reno that it is a very park-like setting. There's grass, there's trees, and I think that will be continued as they expand into the new area.
Well, I know as part of just cemeteries as a whole, people would go to the cemeteries on the weekends and they were park-like. So families could get together, remember their loved ones, but also go and have picnics. So that was a big thing in Virginia City, I know. So I thought that was interesting, maybe water conservation, but yeah, definitely not like other cemeteries of the past. Is the Lone Mountain Cemetery an active cemetery?
Yes, it is. First of all, there's all these different other sections, and I can't speak for them, but it's definitely active. But even the that little section, that little quadrant, that's the Hebrew cemetery. I did show one headstone that was only a few years old. So I don't know anything about how. I haven't looked into how can you still purchase a plot, if that's the right word for it there, or whether these more recent burials were things that were in families for a long time and somebody finally died. I don't know that, but yes, there have both been more fairly recent burials in the Jewish cemetery and definitely in the rest of it.
you mentioned with the nonprofit overseeing the cemetery and what was it, easement is the term you were using. Does that mean that if they needed to move bodies, that gives them
No.
opportunity? I just was curious, the easement
Yeah.
aspect.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question because I know that came up with the Hillside Cemetery and even there used to be a cemetery up near where the university is, and they did disinter bodies there and move them. No, I don't, that is not the intention at all. It's just, and here's something that, unless it's changed in the last few years, being a member in good standing in those two participating congregations gave you a right to a plot there, I believe at no cost, just your membership in the congregation supported that. It didn't give you a headstone, it didn't give you the burial, but it gave you a plot of that easement, a plot of land. So I think that there were, sometimes you wonder why congregations skew older. Well, here's a real incentive, if gee, my days are numbered, I might as well join a congregation, and I know I have a place to lay myself down for eternity. But I think that's still in effect.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is.
So, okay, so someone was just looking, you talked about here comes Sam, there goes Sam. I guess
know who
there
he is?
is a tombstone of a Jewish roofer from Elko. His name was Sam Finn, it's Fein Handler. And his work truck had the message, here comes Sam on the front fender, and there goes Sam on the rear. So that's kind of interesting tidbit.
How long do you think that could be the same one? Whoever said that. Do we know who this, can you reveal who?
It says Martha Mattles, Matles.
Oh, that's Steve Matlis's wife. Yeah. Okay, well, I can follow that one up. That's easy enough. I always thought that was funny, but I felt, he got the short end there without having his full name.
I was thinking the same thing. Oh, poor guy, but
yeah.
Who is he? Who is he?
And I think there was Hebrew on there, and I mean, I can't read the Hebrew, so maybe if you could, it becomes clear. But since that is a deficiency of mine, I'm not going to get that different. So, any more questions?
There's just one more comment saying that there's a Hebrew cemetery near Eureka as well.
Yes. That's why I just kept it geographically centered. And like I said, I didn't know. I knew clearly I knew about the one in Virginia City for decades, including having poor timing, but I didn't know about the one in Carson City until I started doing some research, and that's where we build on the shoulders of other people's research. And I've since been to the cemetery there recently, so but I wouldn't have known, and then I think I would have felt really bad that I had missed a really key piece of this story. So yeah, sometime if I get out to Eureka, I will make a pilgrimage.
Well, thank you, Sharon. This was a lovely talk, and it was very, very informative, and I learned quite a bit about some names I knew, but it was great. So thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure.
Speaker. And so let me, of course, thank the Washoe County Library System. They're wonderful as always, helping us promote our programs and make these events available for everyone. And so I will turn it back to Samantha, and thank you, Sam.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Sharon Honig-Bear, Carol Coleman, Susan Mullen, and Sherry Hayes-Zorn with the Historic Reno Preservation Society, and John, our Washoe County Library tech wizard, for making this event possible tonight. Don't forget, there will be no program in December, and programs will resume with the harps in January 2022. If you'd like to see what's coming up, you can visit us at events.washocountyllibrary.us, where you can download our Virtual Explorer, which is a publication listing of all our virtual and soon to be in-person events. Thank you all. Have a good night.